Well, hello there. Good evening and welcome to the program. You're watching Daily Politics on Trust TV. I'm Abdullahi Ahmed. Thank you most kindly for joining us tonight. Well, on the program tonight, we take a closer look at two key issues shaping Nigeria's democracy. First, a civil society organization, the Africa Center for Leadership and Strategy, has raised concerns over gaps in Nigeria's electoral process. The group is urging the National Assembly to address these issues in the ongoing constitutional amendment, making a case for reforms that can strengthen accountability and help improve Nigeria's democratic experience. Well, tonight on the program, we'll be speaking to the Center's Director of Strategy, Mr. Itia Otabo, is joining us tonight to further the conversation around what is needed, especially from the civil society's perspective, to improve Nigeria's electoral processes. Mr. Otabo, as always, it's good to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. It's good to see you again.
Same here. Thank you for having me.
Right. We're talking about an all too familiar conversation, Nigeria's elections, the gaps that exist, and the very conversation about what needs to be done to improve it. First and foremost, let me get the Center's perspective or review report about what happened over the weekend regarding the by-elections and the rerun elections.
Thank you very much once again for having us here. And I must say that in the conversation we're having just before we went on air, that it's disheartening that when you look at the issues around Nigeria's election, the conversation seems to keep revolving around the same thing. And that also manifested in the elections, by-elections that we had over the weekend, which monitoring that election shows that the same things are reoccurring. Voter buying, thuggery, voter apathy. I mean, those are the recurring issues, and lack of trust and confidence of the electorates, even in the process. And you find that even those who have managed to come out, to come and vote, their experiences are not always palatable. And so we find out that we have reached that place. If this was a snapshot of what we're going to be expecting in 2027, then like you rightly said in your intro, we need to address these gaps. Otherwise, there's no magic wand that we're going to wave in 2 years' time that will give us credible elections in 2027. And that's one of the things that we're doing right now.
And as the Center identified fresh perspectives to these evolving problems, these recurring problems, or are these still pretty much the same perspectives that we've always talked about?
It's pretty much the same thing. And I'd like to contextualize this conversation around the last 6 months of work that the Center has done in partnership with a very strategic partner, which is the Women's Rights Alternative and Women's Rights Advancement and Alternative Protection, WRAPA. Now, over the last 6 months, we've been implementing a project that we call the 6PEN project. 6PEN stands for Civic Space, Poverty and Election in Nigeria. And so what that process has done is that we have interrogated the connection, the nexus between poverty, election, and the shrinking civic space in Nigeria. And those are some of the things that you've brought up in your intro, that those are still the conversation that we're having, especially the endemic poverty. And we've found out that systemic poverty is one of the things that gives rise to the other things you see around our election. And we have discovered that if we don't deal with those issues of poverty, the recurring decimal in terms of what we see in our elections will just be the same thing that we keep finding. And it's also repeated itself in those by-elections.
And we've obviously heard from INEC. There's always this sense that INEC understands the problems. At least it like to, convince Nigerians that it understands the gaps. It is trying to address the gaps. But how believable are some of the explanations from the electoral umpire, in your view, understanding the problems, but also understanding the perspective of the electoral umpire about their 2 cents on what they're actually doing to address those gaps?
Now, one of the things that came out from this implementation of this project is the understanding that it is true, elections are not only based on what you see on the day of election. There are a lot of elements that play into the dynamics that you see that happens on the day of election. For instance, INEC will tell you that their major role is to organize, mobilize, and ensure that what you could call the process of voting is done as best as possible. But you will agree with me that there are a lot of things that will contribute before the day of election that would either enhance or cause a diminishing of that process even on election day. For instance, if INEC is able to come to those polling units and it has all the polling booths, it has those IOs and everybody there, and the voters themselves don't come, INEC could not take it as their own responsibility for them to bring voters there. So there's a lot of things that are also associated with elections, and that's why we're saying that it also might not be right for us to isolate INEC and put INEC there and say, look, they are the sole responsible agency to ensure that. What about those instances that you saw where we actually saw security officers distributing cash for politicians? That's not the job of INEC. And so we're saying that until we look at the systemic, which people have transformed into electoral reform, and we deal in a holistic manner with all of these things, we'll still keep going in that same circle. And as we discuss, we're going to share some of the perspectives that this project has been able to identify.
And let's get right into it, because INEC's explanations always come across as excuses, even though, like you rightly pointed out, there are some of the developments that continue to shape our elections that are well outside INEC's sphere of control, so to say, right?
Yes.
But let's talk about some of those things within INEC's control that need to be addressed urgently. What are some of those points that your recent meetings and policy briefs addressed?
The critical thing, I will tell you, when you look at in terms of INEC involvement in election, has always been around the issues of logistics, issues around even the integrity of the results that INEC is able to give. And that's why you find out that in the lead up to the 2023 election, one of the most fundamental shifts that people believed that we saw was INEC continuous insistence that this election will be credible. Why? Based on the fact that they promised that election results will be uploaded on IREF, everybody can follow the election real time, and everybody can participate in at least seeing how the results are evolving. But we all know what happened at the end of that process. So that in itself became the tainting point that INEC could not extricate itself from. And that's where INEC is right now. So we're saying that even if INEC cannot deal with that issue, because as we're going to find out, by November 6th or thereabout, the current INEC chairman, Professor Mahmoud, will be leaving office. So the questions now begin to arise. How do you appoint, or in appointing a new INEC chairman, what are the things that needs to change that will begin to reduce the perception concerning the negativity that INEC has with the public? And so those are the conversations that we're beginning to have, and we're beginning to say, look, if you're going to reshape the dynamics of our electoral landscape, you must begin to also look at all of these things. Who appoints the INEC chairman? What is the process of appointing the INEC chairman? How does that process feed into public perception about the neutrality of INEC? Feed into the public perception about the credibility of INEC? Feed into the public perception to even accept that whatever outcome INEC is going to declare will be acceptable. So all of those are the conversations that we must have, and they are all interrelated, I must tell you.
And are we dealing with a catch-22 situation here where it doesn't matter who runs INEC? Nigerians will always have biased or warped perception about the electoral umpire. It's almost so that, listen, whoever is in that position will have to deal with the negativity, with the trust deficit that has inundated the system for over 2 decades now. Do you think it's almost a near impossible task for INEC to pretty much shed its skin and rebrand to inspire the hope that is needed for our elections?
Excellent. That I think is the conversation on the street right now. Excellent question. And that is why we think that as of today, the President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, is in a place where he can change the trajectory of elections in Nigeria. He's right there at the point where he can do something that no other president has done, and it will immediately translate. In fact, in the realm of strategy, we call it a strategic lever. Something he will do right now, that what you just mentioned now will completely change. And that is why one of the output of our project work is to call for an alteration in the Constitution to improve trust in INEC leadership. If you can do that, it will not clearly, like you rightly said, there's nobody that you make INEC chairman that people will not have one thing or two to say. But there is a way, a process that we are recommending based on stakeholder aggregation of thoughts that will lessen it. And what are we saying? The president can still retain the power of appointment as enshrined in the Constitution, Section 154. He can still retain that. But we're saying that if the president is to nominate somebody to be INEC chairman, let the process be open. Now, people will argue that even if the president will nominate, he has had consultations behind closed doors. But we're saying that that position is too critical. John Master says leadership is the key. Everything rises and falls on leadership. We're saying that open up the process. Get, like it's been suggested, and based on public validation, get a panel, something like a panel. Bring out the criteria by which you are going to appoint this NH chairman. Let this position be subjected to, even let people apply for it or whatever. But open it up. And once you have opened it up, and everybody understands that this is the criteria by which an INEC chairman in Nigeria will be appointed, and it's there in the public domain, let people apply. Get a panel, whichever way you are going to constitute that panel. There are some recommendations that we have made in terms of those who should form the panel. If the president wants to expand it, if the president wants to deepen it, no problem. But let people know that these are the people that you have put together to do what? To come up with suggestions. And then when they go through that process, at the beginning, 10 people have applied. This panel, based on the criteria that everybody knows, has done their vetting. And we're saying that based on this vetting that we have done, these are the best three. Mr. President, we are recommending these best three to you. He still retains the prerogative.
I mean, obviously, constitutionally, the INEC chairman or nominee, as the case may be, goes through a vetting.
Yes.
The DSS does its own homework, and I suppose that they do have the capacity to, point out red flags and things like that. But a lot of people would want the focus to be on strengthening the institution itself, so much so that whoever comes into that office cannot go outside the bounds of the institution or cannot compromise the integrity of the institution when it comes to our elections. Do you think we also have to, put the spotlight on the institution itself and insulating it from political interference, so much so that it doesn't matter, the credibility question around the person, because the institution itself has been insulated from political interference?
All those conversations, they are all around this very same thing. And some would even argue today that it's not even the institution, the laws, the electoral reform, the electoral law 2022 that is actually, that people are the ones that will do what, that will drive those things. And we know even by study that you cannot take away the position of who is the head of an organization in driving the success of that. So people have talked around put INEC on first line charge. Don't put them at the mercy of the executive that will release the money to them. If INEC gets his money directly from the... So all of these conversations are already there. But I'm telling you that even within the context of these conversations, you cannot remove the fact that at the end of the day, who is the chairman of INEC and what is the integrity of the commissioners also in INEC, there are things that will be right there in your face. And I agree with you. There is nobody you will appoint with this current process. There is nobody you will appoint. People already have, we can identify this person. He was in one political party the other time. It was all. So that will be, but we're saying that to reduce to almost the barest minimum. If the president were to adopt this method, at least give the people that sense that, okay, I want to insulate myself in that way where it does not look as if I'm the only one exercising that prerogative to do this. And we're thinking that that's important. Now, when that is also actually done, you are going to find out it's going to reduce that perception of bias against that. Now, when you now have such a man, and I can tell you that if the man goes through that rigorous vetting, you are going to get a man who should have the pedigree, who should have the institutional capacity to be able to do that. That is when all of these other things you are talking about, building those institutions, will now come into place. And then in tandem, we believe that it will generate a better electoral outcome for us in Nigeria.
Now, your policy brief also pointed at election credibility deficit in Nigeria, and you've pointed out the history of it, right? Yes. From the get-go. Yes. You talk about the parliamentary elections in 59, in 64, in 65, the regional elections. We knew what happened, with Awolowo, and what eventually morphed into the 66 coup and all of that, the 79 elections, the 83 elections. Then you pointed out the moratorium of what many Nigerians consider the freest and fairest election in 93, right? But then 99, 2003, 2007, which according to the records is the worst election we've ever conducted. 2015, somewhat of a relief, so to say, quote unquote, because of the unthinkable that happened with the loss of the PDP's reign in 2015 to the APC. 2019 was contentious to a certain degree. Then 2023, one of the arguably most debated election outcomes. Talk to me about how our history is still shaping our current reality right now, and how the politics of the conversation itself is a part of the problem that we're dealing with.
So you find out that, like what you rightly did in looking at the evolution, the history of Nigeria election, like you rightly said, in fact, there was one of the programs that we had, and somebody was drawing the graph. And you'll see the graph from 1999 going up like this. I think we had almost the largest turnout around the 2007 election. And then you know what happened after that, even the admission of President Mario Yar'Adua, about even the election that brought him into office. And then he went, that was about the time we had the peak. And then it started declining and all of that. And one of the things that we have found is that, like I said to you, and that's why this project really looked at the nexus, is the fact that if you also look at the economic trajectory at that time, you find that there's almost what you could call a convergence. Progressively from that time, the level and the poverty rate in Nigeria has also increased tremendously. And that is why you cannot rule the fact that in looking at the history of election in Nigeria and the evolution of what you're seeing today, you cannot take away poverty. Because we found that poverty seems to be at the very root of some of the things that we are seeing. Why would a citizen be proud to take 5,000 naira, a bag of salt and Maggi, seasoning, to go and cast votes? No, those are the things that we really have to interview. Why is that an attraction to him? Is it because he doesn't have the... I mean, you've seen several videos of people collecting such things and saying, oh, they've been able to get their own share of the national cake. So all of these things are rooted in abject, systemic, and endemic poverty in the system. So you cannot trace that history without connecting it to poverty. We believe that if the Nigerian developmental trajectory is such that people are not in such systemic poverty, or people call today multidimensional poverty, it will not give room to some of those things. Why are there so many people that are available to be talks during elections? Why? Because they're not engaged, or they're underengaged. So I'm saying that these are all the things that you have to look at together. That's why I said from the beginning, you cannot place INEC alone in a vacuum without looking at all of these things that contribute in themselves to building the democratic systems and electoral system that we're looking for. So in answering that in itself is what we have identified majorly. And that's why in this project, we looked and we came up that except you also deal with the issues of poverty, it's going to have concomitant effect on the electoral systems and the electoral process.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it paints quite a dark picture about what we can expect in 2027, doesn't it? Because as you pointed out, the ingredients are there. We're dealing with unprecedented level of poverty in the history of Nigeria, and we've seen that poverty weaponized on election day.
That's right.
The monetization of the process itself.
That's right.
How can it be averted? I mean, you were pointing out what needed to be done.
Yes.
If we're going to change the trajectory, we have to address those structural economic problems around poverty, unemployment, and all of that. And these are things that you cannot address overnight.
Exactly.
Right? So what then can we do in the short term to address those gaps around vote buying, around thuggery, around ballot box snatching, or even the insecurity that affects our electoral process?
So let's be clear. Let's be clear. It's true, we just have about maybe 2 years to 2027. Let's be clear that, yes, you cannot change everything overnight. But you can have a system or a process or a move that will begin to address some of these things. And what we're looking for is that while we might not see a total turnaround in 2027, but you will be able to see that we're on a glimpse. And that is why one of the things that you'll find out even in the civil society space today is a continuous call on the government to deal with issues of multidimensional poverty in the country. You've seen calls consistently speaking to the fact that there's a need to take effective steps, especially to ensure that you put in place very tangible social safety nets to bring people out of this. Because we believe that that in itself is one of the keys. And if you do that, like we said, with ensuring that some of these things that we're recommending in terms of the increasing trust in INEC leadership, as of the time you appoint the chairman, you are doing things like what people are also saying along the line. Why don't you try and bring INEC into first line charge and make sure that they are independently funded? And then you bring things like ensuring that with all of these things, your voter education, and of course, one of the areas that has not been highlighted as it should be, the political parties themselves. So all of these things are there. So we are believing that if we take all of them together, we're not saying that 2027, for instance, what was the percentage of those who voted in 2023? How many percentage relative?
I think the voter turnout was around 35%.
No, it was less than that, with about 23, 24, 25, 20, depending on the data you're looking for. It was less than that. It was up 30%. It was about 9 million people out of 200 and something million people. So depending on the data,
if you consider the voter register.
Yes, yes, about 90 million. People last year was set to about 90 million. So if you look at it, we're saying that whilst you might not have all of that major, but you will see the signs will be there. And that's why I began this conversation by saying that Mr. President is in a point of history here where we will look back and be looking at, could we have done something differently? Because he's
But
there.
do you think politicians are honestly trying to give Nigerians credible elections? Because, to be honest, politicians only care about winning elections. The how of it is immaterial as long as they win, isn't it?
But that's what we're saying. That's why this particular work on protecting civic space, no politician will come out without considering his own self-interest. But how do you mitigate that? When you strengthen the civic space, when you amplify the citizens' voices, you create the ambience, the arena where citizens are able to participate in the governance process, to hold their politicians accountable. And politicians know that the citizens are now mobilized, enlightened, and capacitated to hold them accountable. What are you doing? You are improving the civic space. And once you improve that civic space and you can hold these politicians accountable, you are going to engender a situation whereby the politicians too will know. Let me give you a scenario. Somebody once said, people will tell you that your votes do not count. And then I said, okay, if your votes do not count, why are politicians intent to come and buy it? Why are they intent to come and buy it? So we are saying that these three things, these three nexus, it might not solve all the problem, but we have been able to see from this project that these three things are one of those critical elements that if you are able to deal with it, deal with poverty. Make the civic space robust. Rather than shrinking civic space, make it robust. Let the citizens' voice count. Let people be able to come out. Everybody will not have the same view. But it might not necessarily be a dissenting view because they are opposing you. But they be open to different alternatives, different perspectives. Right. And then make sure that that body that is constitutionally charged with organizing elections has credible leadership. If you can deal with those things, I'm telling you that we might not get to El Dorado, but 2027 will be different. And we still have time to do it.
Right.
To answer your question, we still have time to do it. There's still enough time to do this. And that's why we're saying to you that what happens with the transition of Professor Mahmood is going to be very consequential to the 2027 election.
And if you have to give a yes or no answer to this question around whether you think there is a political will to achieve that, to do it, whether via the amendments or through the process of recruitment, would you say yes or no? Is there a political will to do that?
Wow, that's a very tough question. But I think if I look at, I'm a student of history and strategy. If I look at the president, Abdullahi Ahmed tinubu, I believe that he should be playing in his mind right now. He should be playing in his mind right now that he's standing at a point where what he decides to do, what will history say about it in the years to come? And I think that part of why we're saying all of these things and we're amplifying voices all over the place, over the news and all of that, is also hoping, because we're going to disseminate this to the presidency, let them hear this other point of view. And we're hoping that when the president hears this points of view, saying, still retain the power, the discretion to nominate, but expand it. We are hoping that it could be something that will be fresh. It could be something that he will consider. And like somebody once said in our program, he will take that moral high ground and say, okay, if this is what citizens are saying, if this is what it will take to make them believe more in the process, why not? So at that point that you cannot tell, I can't tell, I don't know what's in the mind of the president or those who are closest to him who are advising him, but it's then that you now be able to look back and say the president was able to exercise a unique political will that generations from now will say that was a pivotal point in the electoral system and processing.
And I think sometimes, especially if you consider Nigerian political history, more often than not, politicians will choose self-preservation over, building a lasting legacy. But let's see what the next couple of months will present.
Sorry, but before you take that, let me just quickly chip this in. Before Jonathan made that phone call, a lot of Nigerians would have believed that it was not possible in Nigeria for a sitting president to concede. A lot of Nigerians would have told you it's not possible. It was something that was novel to the minds of the average Nigerian or the average politician. So, but he did it. So that's the same thing we are saying. The president can come and just do something as novel as that and say, well, if this is what people are saying, or I've listened to all this point of view, I'm going to open the process of nomination, because I also recognize that the perception of trust is really, really the key issue, even concerning this position of the next chairman. So I'll open it up. So I'm not going to rule out the fact that the president, and like I said, the president is a master strategist. It could be a master stroke that will just be what could sway people to say, well, if the president is able to do this, then we can trust him to do other things.
Right.
So let's wait and see.
Something tells me that Jonathan is the exception, not the rule. But let's talk about election credibility, because your policy people also considered that, right?
Yes.
Talk to me about this idea of the Thrive Index, which is supposed to be like a barometer that gauges the credibility of our electoral process. Okay,
so like I said, this project was very heavy in the area of building on what you could call data and research to come to where we are. So we engaged a consultant and we subjected the research findings into very robust discussion. In fact, 2 days policy dialogue was devoted to this. And one of the things that came up is the recommendation of what is called the Thrive Index. And Thrive, Thrive, is an acronym for saying that for us to improve the credibility of elections in Nigeria, the key things are transparency. You cannot improve credibility without showing that this election is transparent. People can actually see. In fact, somebody once said that if the process is transparent, it's easy even for the loser to accept defeat. He knows that everything was clearly done. It didn't measure up. Then we talk about healthy environment. For credibility, we cannot have elections where the environment is heavily militarized, politicized, and all of that. It's not heard, so people can't even come out. And that's what leads to the fact that at the end of the day, you have voter apathy and you have people not coming out. So you must create that healthy environment that will inspire people to feel safe, to actually come out, stay there and vote. And we're saying that it must be reform-oriented, like what we're saying. Reforms does not come in one wholesome. And so we will be able to see that there are credible reforms that are in place. For instance, one of the key reforms we've talked about is even in the appointment of the INEC chairman. It's a reform-based thing. And so when people see that you are doing all of these things, just because you want to create that sense of credibility, it will help. And they were saying inclusivity. Inclusivity. When you look at our elections today, somebody gave us the data of how many millions? I think 30, 40 million. I just want to lay hand on the data of people living with disability in Nigeria. And how many of them actually vote? How many of them actually vote? So there's a segment of the population that is completely disenfranchised because of their state. You know, INEC will keep telling you about the fact that, oh, they have provision for braille, they have provision for this and all of that, and that they're pre-enumerated. So they know where those people will be based on when they capture them during the registration of voters. And so if they're not there on the day of election, then there's nothing they can do because those are specialized tools that they have to bring. So we're saying that inclusivity must be done, and then voter and political education. Now, over time, INEC has argued. They have a department in INEC that's voter and political education. And they've also argued that voter education should be even the work of the political parties. To what extent are even political parties themselves mobilizing even their members, not to talk of even mobilizing the citizens? So, and then finally, equipment functionality. We know about cases where things are deployed. Even though, to be honest with INEC, over time, equipment functionality has improved tremendously. We've had little, except for this last issue about the IRF, mostly the beavers. In fact, I will tell you that most of the CSOs that monitored, if you look at their reports, they will tell you clearly that beavers worked in most of the polling units. I mean, you can give that to INEC. It worked to the extent that it was able to accredit voters. It worked to the extent that it was able, maybe to collect the results and probably take it, escalate it upstairs. So, equipment functionality, but around equipment functionality are things around logistics, even getting those people to get to the place where they ought to be on the evaluation. So we're saying that if we look at this tribe index as a barometer, like you mentioned, right, in terms of judging election result, in terms of judging credibility of election, then we're on the right path when it comes to election credibility. Fantastic analysis as always. Interesting times ahead. As always, these developments are a work in progress. So let's see what the next couple of months will present. 2027 is still some time away. Let's see whether these reforms will kick in. Mr. Itia Otabo, thank you so much as always for stopping by. I appreciate you very much for the analysis. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. Okay. Thank you. We're going to take a quick break now. When we come back, we're going to segue into some politics and the chaos or crisis that is still unraveling in the People's Democratic Party, PDP. More on that after the break.